You're probably going to need to formally designate a principal accounting officer because there are SEC regulations that require certain disclosures, carry liability implications for that principal accounting officer. So who should that be? Your CFO or your controller? Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. So both the CFO and controller are financial leaders within companies, but the roles are different. And unless the company is a startup or on the smaller side, it will have people actually that serve in both positions. It won't be the same person wearing both hats. If a company does indeed have both a CFO and controller, it's common for the controller to be the PAO, the principal accounting officer, because the controller's responsibilities tend to be focused on the company's accounting functions, whereas the CFO is handling the broader finance-related matters. The principal accounting officer, referred to as the PAO sometimes, is a functional designation, just like the chief legal officer is associated with the general counsel position, except the GC is almost always a CLO, but the PAO really could be either the CFO or the controller. Like I said before, it's common for the controller to be designated the PAO, but sometimes it indeed is the CFO. Which brings up the question, does it really matter? Well, it matters a little bit, but not that much. The CFO gets saddled automatically with some pretty heavy SEC obligations, signing the CEO, CFO certifications each quarter under Section 302 and 906 of Sarbanes-Oxley. And the CFO is deemed to be also the PFO, the principal financial officer, which automatically makes that CFO to be a named executive officer, an NEO, and thus included in the voluminous executive compensation disclosures and tables that are required each year in the annual proxy statement. The controller is definitely going to avoid the CEO, CFO certifications unless the controller is also the CFO, which, like I said, sometimes happens at smaller companies. And the controller might indeed avoid NEO status unless they happen to fall within the top 5 highest paid officers, which actually isn't that common. So let's talk about the consequences of being deemed the PAO. The PAO automatically is an officer as defined under the Section 16 rules. So that person will be making Forms 3, 4s, and 5 filings with the SEC. You'll need some Form 10K disclosure about executive officers. And although many companies deem their Section 16 officers and executive officers to be the same group of people, some companies don't and determine that their PAO or the controller doesn't have a policy-making function. So they aren't covered by Rule 3B7, aren't deemed to be an executive officer, and thus not required to have that little bit of disclosure in the 10K about them. The 10K is required to be signed by the company's CEO, the principal financial officer, which would be the CFO, its controller or principal accounting officer, and at least a majority of the board. So the CFO and controller are both in that category. They're both signing the 10K. So let's talk about the Form 8K. A termination, retirement, or resignation of certain officers triggers a disclosure requirement under Item 502B of Form 8K. And the appointment of these types of officers triggers a disclosure requirement as well. That's under Item 502C. The enumerated officers include the principal financial officer and principal accounting officer. So if the controller is the PAO, their comings and goings will be announced via a Form 8K. And that's pretty much it. So there's not a whole lot to it. Most boards make a formal designation by board resolution or other board action, typically when they approve all officers at a certain level or higher in the annual election of officers as provided in that company's bylaws. Or maybe the board will delegate the authority to designate a PO to the CEO or CFO. And if the company doesn't formally designate a PAO, some of the SEC rules tap the controller as the PAO by default. Anyways, let me know what you think.